Greetings, fellow Obsidizens of the vast Obsidian community. Welcome to another video in the Obsidian for Noobs video series, featuring tutorials, tips, and tools for new users of the Obsidian personal knowledge management software. This video is intended to serve as a primer for using CSS with Obsidian. I'm going to cover everything you need to know in order to create and employ CSS snippets in your Obsidian vaults. In particular, this video will be divided into 5 parts, covering what is CSS, CSS Style Rule, CSS Style Rules, CSS Snippets, incorporating CSS snippets into your vault, and vault-wide versus Note-specific CSS Snippets. CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, refers to a set of rules that are used to specify the styling of elements contained in certain types of documents, such as, for example, web pages. Obsidian allows the use of CSS for styling the design and appearance of elements within its vaults. I say that Obsidian allows the use of CSS because using CSS with Obsidian is entirely optional. You can work with Obsidian just fine without ever having to learn or use CSS. However, employing CSS in your Obsidian vaults affords you a great deal of personal control over the appearance of various elements and features of your vaults. And for that reason, I think it is worth learning at least a little bit about CSS. In CSS, you apply a style to a document or part of a document by employing a style rule. A CSS style rule tells Obsidian to select some part of the user interface, UI, and assign a specific value to a specific property of that element. In general, the basic format of a CSS style rule would look as shown here. Please note that the words selector, property, and value represent the general names of those components, and would be replaced by the actual identifiers in a real case situation, as I will demonstrate shortly. The selector identifies what is being targeted or selected by the CSS snippet. The property identifies the particular property that will be affected by the CSS snippet, and the value identifies the particular value being assigned to that property. This is best understood by looking at a specific example. Let's imagine that you want the color for all heading 2 text in your Obsidian UI to be red. The CSS style rule to accomplish that would look as shown. In this example, the selector is body, the property is H2 color, and the value is red. This style rule is telling Obsidian that we want the style rule to target the body of our document, meaning the entire vault. This is the selector, in such a way that it sets the color of all heading 2 text, this is the property, to the color red. This is the value being assigned to that property. Obsidian refers to user-created CSS files as CSS snippets. A CSS snippet is simply a CSS file that contains one or more CSS style rules that are intended to be applied to an Obsidian project. I'll illustrate the process for creating a CSS snippet by using the real case example that was given in the previous section. Let's suppose again that I want to create a CSS snippet that will make all heading 2 text in my vault have the color red. First, I have to create the CSS style rule to accomplish this. We've already done that in the previous section. The style rule is. Next, I must create a CSS file that contains this style rule. This file should be created using a plain text editor. Windows Notepad works well, but other programs are available. I can type the code into Notepad exactly as it appears on screen if I wish, but most coders would break it up as follows for clarity. Note the structure used here. The selector, body, plus the open bracket are on the first line. The property, H2 color, and its value, red, are on the second line, with required punctuation, and the closing bracket is on the third line. The format and the punctuation matter in these snippets. It's also a good coding practice to include a comment in the file. Comments are not executed with the code. Rather, they are there to convey information about the code to a human who might read it. Comments in CSS are opened with a /*, and are closed with an */, as shown now on screen. You can put any text you like in place of comment text, but the idea is that the comment should describe what the style rule is intended to accomplish. In the case of our example, I might put the following comment in my CSS file. Changes all heading 2 text color to red. After I've typed this code into Notepad, I then must save the file. I can use any file name I choose, preferably a name that describes what the snippet does. For this example, I'll call it h2color-red. By default, Notepad applies a txt file extension to its files, but a CSS file must have CSS as its extension. So when I save the file, I must save it as h2color-red.css. An important point is that we cannot save this file to just any location. In order for Obsidian to be able to find this file and execute the CSS style rules it contains, we must save the CSS file to a special folder. Obsidian expects to find CSS snippets in a folder named Snippets that is located in the .obsidian subfolder in your Vault's main folder. If you store your CSS snippets in any other folder, Obsidian won't find them and won't be able to execute the CSS style rules they contain. You can create a CSS snippets folder as follows. In Obsidian, go to Settings, Appearance, CSS Snippets. To the right of CSS Snippets, click the folder icon. This will open the Snippets folder if it exists, or if one does not exist, it will create the Snippets folder and then open it in Windows File Explorer. Let me demonstrate that process now. I am now in an Obsidian test vault that I've created. I'm clicking on the Settings icon. In Settings, I'm clicking on Appearance, and then I'm scrolling down to CSS Snippets. To the extreme right, you see a folder icon. If I already have a Snippets folder and I click the icon, it will open the folder. If I don't have a Snippets folder, then clicking this icon will create the Snippets folder in the appropriate location, which is in the .obsidian subfolder of your Vaults folder. I'm in Windows Explorer now. This is the folder for the test vault that I'll be using for this video. When I open it, you see the .obsidian folder, and when I open that, you see the Snippets folder. Now that we know how to create simple CSS style rules and CSS snippets, and we have a snippets folder in which to save them, we are ready to incorporate CSS into our Obsidian project. This is the process for incorporating a CSS snippet into an Obsidian Vault. First, you create a CSS snippet in a plain text editor, such as Windows Notepad. Then you save the CSS snippet file using a CSS file extension in the Snippets folder, which as we saw is in the .obsidian subfolder of your Vault. In your Vault, go to Settings, Appearance, CSS Snippets, and find the snippet listed there under the file name you saved it with. If you don't see the snippet listed, click the Refresh Reload icon. That is next to the folder icon. To the right of your CSS snippet, slide its corresponding switch to On to activate the snippet. The switch will be purple in color when it's on. Now check a note that should be affected by this snippet to ensure that the snippet is working properly. For example, did the color or style change as you expected? Let me demonstrate this process with an actual example. Let's use the Heading 2 Color CSS snippet we've been working with. I have Windows Notepad open and I have the snippet already in there, in exactly the way we saw it previously. I have the comment, changes all Heading 2 text color to red, and the actual body of the snippet. The selector is body, the property is h2 color, and the value being assigned to that property is red, all using the correct syntax and punctuation. I'm going to save this snippet now. Remember, I can select any name I choose. I'm going to call it h2 color-red. And remember, the file extension must be CSS. By default, Windows Notepad uses a txt file extension, so I must change that to CSS. And I must save my snippet to the Snippets folder in the .obsidian folder of my Vaults folder. This is the Vault folder, there's the .obsidian folder, and here's my Snippets folder. So I'm saving my CSS snippet file under the name h2color-red with a CSS file extension in the Snippets folder of my Vault. Once I've done that, I can open my Vault, go to Settings, Appearance, scroll down to CSS Snippets, and find the snippet. If you don't see it listed, click the Refresh Reload button. But it's already here. I go all the way over to the switch, and I switch it on. And as I said earlier, the switch turns purple when it's on. That activates the snippet in the vault. Now I want to test the snippet. So I go into Note, and I type some heading 2 text. And as you can see, it's red. If I do some other kind of heading text, it's not red. Because I put body as the selector in my CSS style rule, this snippet will affect my entire vault. If I create a new note and I type heading 2 text, you can see it's red. This is a vault-wide CSS snippet. And that's all there is to incorporating a CSS snippet into an Obsidian vault. Again, to review, create the snippet in a plain text editor such as Windows Notepad. Save the snippet file using a CSS file extension in the Snippets folder, which is in the .obsidian subfolder of your vault. In your vault, go to Settings, Appearance, CSS Snippets. Find the snippet listed there under the file name you saved it with. If you don't see it, click the Refresh Reload button. To the right of the snippet, slide its corresponding switch to On to activate the snippet. And then open a note and create something in the note that should be affected by the snippet to ensure that it's working properly. If your CSS snippet is not functioning as expected, then troubleshoot it as follows. First, check that your CSS snippet style rule code and syntax are correct. This is very important. Every punctuation you see in a CSS style rule is necessary. The hyphens, the squiggly brackets, and so forth. Semicolons. So double check that you've correctly structured the snippet style rule. If that's okay, then ensure that you saved it using a CSS extension. If you're using something like Windows Notepad, it's very easy to forget that part and save it with a TXT extension, which as we saw is the default. The snippet then won't work. So double check that you use the correct CSS file extension. If that's right, then make sure you saved it in the correct location, meaning the snippets folder within the .obsidian folder in your vault's main folder. And if that's right, then ensure that you set the snippet switch to On and that you reloaded the snippet in Obsidian settings. 2 additional points I should make. First, it is possible to have several style rules contained within a single CSS snippet. And secondly, it is possible to change features other than colors with a CSS snippet. Let's look at an example where I use a CSS snippet to change both the color and thickness of horizontal lines in Obsidian. The text in bold represents a CSS snippet that contains 2 style rules. One to change the color of a horizontal line, and another to change its thickness. HR stands for horizontal rule. Notice I put a comment for each style rule. Again, this is for human consumption. Horizontal line color and horizontal line thickness. You see the familiar structure? I've got my selector, body in each case, the open and close brackets. The property for the color of a horizontal line in Obsidian is HR-color. All the hyphens, by the way, are important here. So technically it's -HR-color. The colon is part of the punctuation required in a snippet. This is the value being assigned, dim gray. It's one of the many color possibilities available. The semicolon is important as well as part of the punctuation of a CSS style rule. You can find lists and tables of color names and color codes all over the internet. For the horizontal line thickness, the selector for that is -HR-thickness. I'm using a technique here called EM. So I'm assigning a thickness of 0.15 EM to the horizontal line. In CSS, EM is a unit of measurement which indicates size relative to the size of the font. 1 EM means equal to the current font size, and 2 EM means 2 times the current font size, and so forth and so on. For example, in a 2 EM unit of measurement, if your font is 12 pixels, then 2 EM equals 24 pixels. I'm making the thickness of the line here 0.15 EM, and you're going to see that's actually thicker than the default size of a horizontal line in an Obsidian vault. One point I want to make before we go on with this involves the property expressions, which are called variables. I often find the hardest part of structuring a CSS snippet is figuring out what the variable is for a feature that I want to change or affect by my CSS snippet. Fortunately, in the Obsidian online help, they have a list of the variable names for the various properties that can be used in CSS snippets. Let me show you that now. Okay, I have my browser open to Obsidian's online help. And you can see in the left part, under Reference, there's an area called CSS Variables. And that's where I'm at now. And they break the variables down by various categories. Foundations, components, and so forth. If you look under Editor, you see horizontal rule. And when I click on that, it shows me the two variables that are available for me to affect features of the horizontal line in Obsidian. The two I've used in the snippet I just showed you and which we will go back to shortly. HR color, which is the horizontal rule border color, and HR thickness, the horizontal rule border thickness. Notice the hyphens. As I said earlier, they're important. They're part of the name of the variable. So you have to be very, very careful with how you structure your CSS snippets and your CSS style rules. You must use the correct punctuation for the style rule, and you must use the correct symbols and punctuation in the variable names that you use. Going back over here, you can see that there are variables for just about everything, probably everything, in Obsidian. If I click on link, these are the various variables available to affect features of links in Obsidian. Link color hover, so forth and so on. Okay, back to our snippet. Remember, I'm demonstrating a snippet here that affects things other than color, and also that contains two style rules in one snippet. Just to review, one style rule affects the color of horizontal lines, and the other style rule affects its thickness. And we just saw the variables now in Obsidian's online help. The variable for the color of a horizontal rule and the variable for a thickness. Okay, you see here I've put the code for our CSS snippet into Windows Notepad, exactly as it was in my PowerPoint presentation. I've got the comment horizontal line color, and then the CSS style rule to change the color of a horizontal line. Selector is body, property is HR color, value is dim gray. Another comment, horizontal line thickness. Again, selector is body. This time the variable for the property is HR thickness, and the value I'm assigning to it is 0.15 EM. And I've got all the appropriate punctuation. I'm going to save this snippet. Let me call it HR color thickness. And remember, I have to change the file extension to CSS. And I'm going to save it in the snippets folder of my vault, which it happens to be there already because I've used this previously to demonstrate the other snippet. Going now to my vault, I open Settings, Appearance. I scroll down to CSS Snippets, and I find the snippet that I just saved, HR color thickness. I turn it on. Actually, you know what? Let me not turn it on. And in a note, let me create a horizontal line. That's the horizontal line before I apply the snippet. You can barely see it. That's the default appearance. Now I'll go into Settings, Appearance, CSS Snippets, and turn on the snippet. And when we go back, the change is barely noticeable. So let's change something in the snippet. I'm changing the color of the line to red, and I'm going to change the thickness to 0.5 EM. One nice thing about these snippets is once you've created the snippet and you've saved it into the snippets folder of your vault, If you don't like the change it made, you can open that file, make the appropriate change within the snippet, and then just resave it. Watch the screen now as I resave this file to my vault. Now you see the line appears red, and it's much, much thicker than the standard default value. Let's go into Settings, Appearance, and Snippets, and let me turn it off. If I disable the snippet, the line is back to its default thickness and color. If I re-enable the snippet, I get the thicker line with the red color. The last concept I'd like to cover in this video is the difference between what I call vault-wide versus Note-specific CSS snippets. Recall that in a CSS style rule, the selector portion identifies what is being targeted by the CSS snippet. In other words, the scope of the impact of the CSS snippet. Up until now, we've had body as the selector in our snippets, and we've seen that this makes the snippet target the entire vault. Another option for the selector is what is called a CSS class. Identifying a CSS class as the selector in your snippet gives you the flexibility to limit the impact of your snippet to individual notes in your vault, rather than across the entire vault. Let's see how that's accomplished. This is the process for creating and using a CSS class in Obsidian. I'll talk through the process now, and then I'll demonstrate it with an actual example. You can choose any name you like for the CSS class, but no spaces. Put the CSS class name preceded by a period in the selector portion of the CSS snippet. In other words, in place of where we've been putting body. Then you save the CSS snippet in your vault, just as we've discussed. And also, as we've discussed, go to Settings, Appearance, CSS Snippets, and turn the snippet on. Then in a note, you open the note's YAML properties, which you can accomplish by typing 3 dashes directly under the note's title. When the YAML properties open, select CSS classes from the drop-down list. Type the name of the CSS class that you used in your CSS snippet, but without the period, in the space to the right of CSS classes. Or if it pops up in the list, then just select it from the list. Then test the snippet by creating something in a note that should be affected by it. All right, that sounds like a lot of double talk. Let's look at an actual example. I'm going to use the style rule to change the heading 2 color to red that we used at the beginning of the video. Since I'm going to demonstrate that using CSS classes now, I'm going into my vault, the Settings, Appearance, and CSS Snippets, and I'm going to turn off the vault-wide snippet we created earlier, the one that changed all heading 2 color to red across the entire vault. And I'm going to apply a new snippet that utilizes this concept of CSS classes, which is this snippet here. And I'm going to turn that off as well. Okay, here's the snippet I'm going to use to demonstrate the concept of a CSS class. The general structure is the same. I have a comment, I have the brackets, the semicolon and the colon. I've got a body, a property, and a value. The change here, the difference, is in the selector. Instead of the word body, I have period H2 hyphen red. I chose the name myself. That's the CSS class. You can give it any name you desire. No spaces, and it must be preceded by a period. So I could have had H2 red without the hyphen. I could have had heading 2 red with or without a hyphen. It's up to me. Just no spaces, and it must be preceded by a period. Otherwise, everything else in the structure of the CSS style rule is the same. Open and close brackets, the variable name for the property you want to affect, and the value word for the value you want to assign to that property. And again, the same punctuation. The open and close brackets, the colon separating the property from the value, and the semicolon ending that sentence. This snippet is saved to my snippets folder in my .obsidian folder of my vault, just like all other snippets. I've already done that, so I won't demonstrate that now. I'm going to open my vault. I'm going into Settings, Appearance, CSS Snippets, and I'm going to the snippet that I saved. I saved it under the name h2-color_CSS-class. Again, the file name is my own choice. It must have a CSS extension, and you can see here it does. Right? All snippets must have a CSS extension. When I create a snippet that is a CSS class, as opposed to a snippet that affects my entire vault, I like to put CSS class in the file name so that I can immediately identify, when I look at my list of snippets, which ones involve a CSS class and which ones involve the entire body. That's just my own technique for my own benefit. But you can give it any name you want. And I'm going to turn that snippet on. That snippet, recall, changes heading 2 color to red. Let me go in this note and create a heading 2. But it's not red. That's because I have not activated the snippet. For vault-wide snippets, in other words, snippets that have body as the selector, once you save it to the folder and turn it on, it immediately affects the entire vault. And anything affected by that snippet will be affected by it within your vault. That's why when I had the other snippet for changing heading 2 color to red with body as the selector, as soon as I turned it on, anywhere as I put heading 2 text, it was red. To activate a CSS class, as I mentioned earlier, I have to open up the YAML properties for the node. And you do that by going directly under the node's title and typing 3 hyphens. And you see properties. These are called YAML properties. There are 3 choices. We're working with CSS classes, so I select that. Once I've selected that, I'm going to put the actual one that I want to activate here in this space. If I have it saved, and if Obsidian is already aware of it, then it'll show up in the list. The first time you use it, it won't show up in the list. Even if it's saved, even if it's turned on, it will not show up in the list. So you have to type the name that you put here. An important point, you do not use the period here. Right? The name that pops up here is the CSS class that you put in your snippet. This part. Except in the snippet, it must have a period before it. But when you use it in your vault, you omit the period. It must be the same exact name or the same word or the same phrase you used in your snippet, in my case, h2-red, but without the period. The period is required in the CSS snippet. It must be omitted when you use it in your vault. I select that CSS class, and my heading 2 text immediately turns red. Now this snippet only applies to this node. It will only apply to notes where I put it in the YAML properties on the CSS classes. That's the difference between this and a CSS snippet that has body as the selector. Remember, body says apply this snippet to the entire vault. Using a CSS class in your snippet restricts the use to only notes where you put it up in the YAML properties. This gives you some control. So if I only want my heading 2 text to be read in selected notes, I would use a CSS class. If I want my heading 2 text to be read across my entire vault, I would put body in the selector in the CSS snippet. Let me create another note. And I'll put in some heading 2 text. It's not red. I go under the title, type 3 hyphens to open the YAML properties. I select the CSS class property, and then I select the snippet that I want. And it immediately takes effect. Using a CSS class allows you to only impact notes where you want that CSS snippet to apply. So there you have it, the basics of creating and using CSS snippets in Obsidian. As you can see, employing CSS in your Obsidian vaults gives you tremendous power and control over the appearance of many vault features, without the need to install community-created themes or plugins. You can tailor your vault's appearance to suit your own personal needs and taste, and you can enjoy the satisfying feeling of having done it all by yourself. Okay, fellow Obsidizens, that's all I have for now. I'll see you in the next video. Happy note-taking.